Hi everybody, and welcome to our first difficult Bible words for kids. For the next 3 Sundays, I'm going to be looking at one word each week that is a very difficult word that we find in the Bible and helping you kids to understand it better. So our first word this week is propitiation. Now, I know some of you are thinking, Jen, why did you pick such a hard word? Well, I picked this word because I think it's one of the most important words in the Bible. And I do believe that you kids can understand it through through this science experiment that we're going to do. So we find propitiation, one of the places where we find it is in the ESV translation in 1 John, where John says that Jesus came to be the propitiation for our sins. And we read in chapter 4, verse 10, that this is love. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his son Jesus to be a propitiation for our sins. So where propitiation happens is on the cross, where Jesus died and took the punishment for our sins. Now, it's a very hard word to understand, but I think through this science experiment, you guys can have a pretty good idea of what that big word propitiation means. So I have here a balloon that is just filled with air. And I want you to think about what is going to happen if I hold this flame up to the balloon. Most of you are going to guess that the balloon will pop. So let's see if you're right. I don't really like this part because I don't like popping balloons, but let's see what happens. Whoa, instant popping. The reason that happens is because the flame has heat in it, and the rubber from the balloon just can't take the heat, so it bursts. Now, in order to explain propitiation, I have a balloon here that's filled with air and a little bit of water. Let's see what happens when we hold the flame up to the balloon. Now, before I do that, I just want to explain a little bit about what this flame represents. And in order to understand that, we're going to talk about God's anger towards sin. Now, we know that sin is bad. Sin is anything we do that is against God, and it separates us from God, who is perfect and loving. Now, it makes sense, and it's good and right and fair that God should be angry when we sin. You guys understand the concept of fairness. I know that the first thing you do, if your brother or sister or your friend or somebody gets away with sin, gets away with something bad, the first thing you do is you say, hey, that's not fair. Well, God is perfectly fair. And in being perfectly fair, he is angry towards sin. So when Jesus died on the cross, God didn't stop being angry about sin. He didn't change his mind like this, where he was angry about sin. And then when Jesus died on the cross, he just stopped being angry. He's still angry about sin. But this is what propitiation is. So I'm going to show you. In this balloon, we have air and a little bit of water. Now, when I hold up the flame, which we can think of sort of like God's anger or God's wrath towards sin, to the balloon with the water in it, I want you to see what happens. The balloon doesn't burst. The reason for that is that the water inside of the balloon takes on the heat from the flame. So if we think about the flame as being like God's anger towards sin, we can think of the water as being like Jesus' death on the cross. When we have Jesus in us, when we put our faith and our trust in him, when we believe that he died on the cross and rose again, we have him in us, and God's anger or God's wrath towards our sin, which should go towards us, instead it goes towards Jesus. We can say that in another way, that God's anger towards sin is appeased or satisfied. Those are big words that mean that God's anger towards sin is turned onto Jesus instead of being turned onto us. God's anger towards sin is taken on by Jesus instead of being taken on by us. That's what propitiation is. And it's one of the most, if not the most, important word or important idea in the whole Bible. That in dying on the cross, Jesus took God's anger, which is fair and good and right, that he should be angry about sin. And his anger, instead of being put onto us, was put onto Jesus. And that's what allows allows us to be in a close relationship with God, is through Jesus propitiating our sin on the cross. So I hope that helps you to understand what the word propitiation means. It's not a word that you're going to use every day, but I hope it's a word that you will think about often, because it's a very important word in the Bible. And I want to say that a lot of you will read the NIV translation of the Bible, and in the NIV translation, rather than using the word propitiation, the word or the phrase is atoning sacrifice. So propitiation, atoning sacrifice, atonement, or one more, and this is also a hard one, substitutionary atonement. Those are all big words that mean that Jesus took on God's anger for our sin on the cross. Okay, so whenever you hear those words, I want you to think about this experiment and think about the fact that rather than you and I having to take the punishment for our own sin, if we accept and put our trust in Jesus, he has taken that on for us, and that is propitiation.